For 51 years, she never once removed her wedding ring, not when her husband was lowered into the frozen ground, not when the loneliness hollowed her out from the inside. But on a Thursday morning, in a muddy kill pen behind the county auction, she slid that thin gold band from her finger and pressed it into a stranger's palm. The price of a dying horse. What that old chestnut gelding did the moment he stepped onto her farm didn't just break her heart. It shattered everyone who saw it. Her name was Elena Vance, 76 years old, living alone on a failing 20-acre spread in southern Ohio that hadn't turned a profit since her husband Jack died 13 years earlier. The ring she traded was the only thing she never pawned. Through medical bills, foreclosure threats, and winters she heated the farmhouse with a wood stove she fed herself. But the horse she bought that morning wasn't just old. He was considered dangerous, unrideable, scheduled for slaughter. And what Elena didn't know, what the auction house deliberately hid from her, is that this horse had a secret that would force the entire county to rethink everything they believed about loyalty and loss. To understand what Elena saw in that kill pen, you have to understand what she had already buried. Long before she traded her wedding ring for a horse nobody wanted, she was the wife of a man who whispered to horses like they were old friends. Jack Vance was a farrier by trade, a craftsman who shaped iron with fire and sweat, but his real gift was something else entirely. He could walk into a barn where a frightened colt was trembling in the corner and within minutes have that animal eating from his palm. The local horse community called him the horse talker. Some said it was a joke. Most said it was something closer to holy. Elena met him when she was 19, working the concession stand at the county fair. He was 22, freshly returned from a tour in Korea, with hands scarred from shrapnel and a gentleness that caught her completely off guard. They married 6 months later, bought the 20-acre parcel off Route 52, and built a life around horses. Jack shod them. Elena trained them. Together, they rescued dozens of animals that others had abandoned, restoring them to health and finding them homes. The farm wasn't profitable in the way accountants measure profitability, but it was rich in the currency that mattered: purpose, partnership, love. Then 13 years ago, Jack's heart stopped while he was trimming the hooves of a Belgian draft horse named Samson. He simply slumped forward, still holding the rasp, and was gone before his body hit the barn floor. Elena found him an hour later, the Belgian standing motionless over him, refusing to leave his side. She buried Jack under the old white oak at the edge of the north pasture, the spot where he'd proposed to her 47 years earlier. The ring she'd worn every day since, through the funeral, through the mounting debt, through the winter nights when she huddled beside the wood stove, burning old fence posts because she couldn't afford propane. She never pawned it, never considered it. It was the one piece of him she could still touch. The farm decayed around her. The horses were sold off one by one to cover property taxes. The roof leaked. The fences sagged. Elena aged into a woman the town largely forgot existed, a ghost in overalls who still got up at dawn to feed the 3 chickens that constituted her remaining livestock. Her children, grown and scattered to cities in different time zones, called on Sundays and pleaded with her to move into assisted living. She refused. This land was her marriage. Leaving it felt like divorce. The morning of the Chilton County livestock auction dawned gray and bitter cold. Elena hadn't planned to go. She'd driven into town in her rusted pickup to buy chicken feed at the co-op when she saw the hand-painted sign, "Auction today, all stock must go." Something pulled her into the parking lot. She told herself she was just looking, just remembering what it felt like to be around horses again. The auctioneer's chant echoed from the main barn, but Elena wandered toward the back, toward the holding pens where the undesirables were kept. The old ones, the injured ones, the ones destined for the slaughterhouse trucks idling in the rear lot, their exhaust plumbing white in the November air. And that is where she saw him. A chestnut gelding, maybe 23 years old, standing in a pen so narrow he couldn't turn around. His ribs laddered his sides. His coat was dull, patched with rain rot. Dried blood crusted his hocks where he'd been kicking the metal panels. A handwritten sign zip-tied to the gate read 2 words, "Dangerous, kill only." The kill buyer had already tagged him. His price was set at what the slaughter plant paid by the pound. Elena stood there for 20 minutes, not moving, not speaking. The gelding, who had been wild-eyed and thrashing when she arrived, slowly grew still. He turned his massive head toward her. Old horses have a way of looking at you that goes straight through to the bone, and this one's gaze held something that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. As if he had been waiting for her, as if he knew her. She would later tell the sheriff, when the story turned strange and began to attract official attention, that in that moment the horse's eyes were Jack's eyes. But she knew how grief could play tricks on a lonely mind, so she didn't say that part out loud. At least not at first. She went to find the auction manager, her wedding ring already twisting off her finger. The auction manager was a man named Dwayne Pettigrew, a fat-knuckled operator in a stained Carhartt jacket who had spent 30 years turning animal misery into profit margins. When Alina approached him, ring in hand, he laughed. Actually laughed, a wet, wheezing sound that made his jowls shake. He told her the horse was dangerous, had nearly crushed a handler 2 days earlier, and that the kill buyer was already backing his truck up to the loading chute. She didn't argue. She just held out the ring, the thin gold band that had lived on her finger since 1961, and said, "This is worth more than what that kill buyer's paying by the pound. You know it, I know it. Now take it and give me my horse." Dwayne squinted at the ring, held it up to the weak November light filtering through the auction barn's grimy windows, and bit down on it the way men in movies test gold. Satisfied, he pocketed it and shrugged. "He's your problem now, lady, but when he puts you through a fence, don't come crying to me." He gestured toward the kill pen without looking up from his clipboard. "Bill of sales in the office. Cash only." Alina told him he already had her cash. She walked out without another word. Getting the gelding home required help she did not want to ask for. Her neighbor, a retired trucker named Lyle Crandall, had a 2-horse trailer rusting behind his garage. She hadn't spoken to Lyle in months, not since he'd suggested she sell the farm and move to a condo in Columbus. But when she knocked on his door and explained what she'd done, his face shifted. He'd known Jack. Everybody had. He pulled the trailer out and followed her back to the auction yard without a single complaint. The kill buyer had already moved on to his next purchase, a load of 12 horses bound for a plant in Quebec. Alina watched the trailer rumble past, exhaust plumbing, and thought of all the horses inside who would not find a ring. The chestnut stood motionless in his pen, watching her approach with an intensity that made the auction hands keep their distance. When Alina unlatched the gate, one of them called out a warning. She ignored it. She stepped inside, closed the gate behind her, and stood with the horse in the narrow space. He didn't move. His breathing was ragged, his body trembling from exhaustion and malnutrition, but his eyes stayed locked on hers. She reached up slowly and touched his forehead, right where the white blaze widened into a crooked star. He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to empty every ounce of fight remaining in him, and lowered his massive head until it rested against her shoulder. The auction hands went quiet. The gelding who had been labeled dangerous, who had thrashed and kicked and bitten everyone who came near him, stood perfectly still, leaning into a 76-year-old widow like a child seeking comfort. Alina felt her throat tighten. "Let's go home," she whispered. The drive back to the farm was slow and silent. Lyle kept glancing in his rearview mirror, expecting the horse to start thrashing in the trailer, but nothing happened. The gelding stood quietly, head low, rocking with the motion of the road. When they arrived and Alina led him out, the first thing he did was lift his nose to the wind, sampling the air of a place he had never been. And then, without hesitating, he began walking. Not toward the barn, not toward the water trough, but toward the north pasture, toward the old white oak where Jack was buried. Alina stood frozen at the trailer as the chestnut crossed the frostbitten grass with a purpose that looked nothing like a lost animal and everything like a man who knew exactly where he was going. He stopped at the oak, lowered his head, and stood motionless. The hair on Alina's arms rose despite the cold. Lyle stared, his mouth slightly open. "Alina," he said, his voice unsteady, "that horse has never been on this property before, has it?" She shook her head, unable to speak. "Then how in the hell does he know where Jack is buried?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Alina spent the next week in a state of suspended disbelief. She set up the gelding in the same stall Jack had built for Samson, the Belgian draft horse who had been standing over Jack's body when she found him. That stall had been empty for 13 years. She'd never had the heart to put another horse in it. She hung buckets of warm water, spread fresh straw, and sat with the chestnut through the long nights, feeding him small handfuls of soaked hay when he was too weak to eat on his own. The vet, Dr. Miriam Okonkwo, came out on day 2 and gave the same grim prognosis she'd given for every rescue Alina and Jack had ever taken in. Severe malnutrition, brain rot, a low-grade respiratory infection, and teeth so worn down that eating was painful. "He's at least 23, Miriam said, shining a penlight into the horse's mouth. "Maybe older. Honestly, Alina, the kindest thing might be..." Alina cut her off. He didn't come this far to give up now, and neither did I. The gelding improved slowly, then suddenly. By the fourth day, he was standing without trembling. By the fifth, he nickered when Alina entered the barn. By the sixth, he began doing something that defied explanation. Whenever Alina stood near the stall door, he would reach his muzzle toward her left hand, the hand that had worn the ring, and press his lips gently against her bare finger, exactly where the band used to sit. He did it every time, with a precision that seemed calculated. If she offered her right hand, he ignored it. Left hand, no ring, directly on the pale stripe of skin where the gold had been. The first time it happened, Alina froze. The second time, she wept. By the 10th time, she started asking questions she was afraid to answer. She dug out the old photo albums from the cedar chest. Photographs of Jack with his horses, the farm in its prime, the life they'd built. She needed to prove to herself that she wasn't imagining things, that the gelding's markings were merely a coincidence. She found a picture dated October of 2005, Jack leaning against the fence, Samson the Belgian standing behind him. Samson was a massive bay with a white blaze, not a chestnut, completely different. Relief flooded her, and then she turned the page and found a photograph she had forgotten existed, Jack at the county fair in 1998, kneeling beside a skinny chestnut colt with a white star on his forehead. A colt that a breeder had been about to put down because of a leg deformity. Jack had bought him for $50 and named him Copper. He'd worked with Copper for 2 years, trained him, found him a home with a family in Michigan. Alina had not thought about Copper in 2 decades. She stared at the photograph, then at the horse standing in Samson's old stall, then at the photograph again. The white blaze, the crooked star, the placement of the chestnut markings on the legs. She called the family in Michigan. The number was disconnected. She called an old friend of Jack's, a farrier named Tommy Rourke, who was now in his 80s and living with his daughter in Indiana. When Tommy heard her voice, he laughed with surprise. "Ellie Vance, you're still kicking. What can I do for you?" She described the horse, the white star, the behavior, the way he went straight to the oak tree, the way he pressed his nose to her ring finger. The line went quiet. When Tommy spoke again, his voice was thick. "Ellie, I shod that horse about 8 years ago for a woman up near Dayton. She'd bought him from a trader who got him from some auction in Michigan. He had a Freeze brand on his left shoulder. Did you check the shoulder?" Alina hadn't. The chestnut's coat was so matted, so patched with rain rot and old scars, that she'd missed it. She put the phone down and went to the barn. She ran her fingers through the rough winter coat on the gelding's left shoulder, parting the hair. And there it was, faint but unmistakable, the brand Jack had always used on his rescues, a small letter V inside a horseshoe, the Vance mark. The horse standing in Jack's stall, seeking out Jack's grave, pressing his muzzle to her missing ring, was Copper, the colt Jack had saved, the one he'd trained and loved and let go of 30 years ago. He had come back. Through slaughterhouses and neglect, through a dozen owners and a kill pen in southern Ohio, he had found his way home. And she had bought him with the ring Jack gave her, on the same land where Jack was buried. Alina sank to her knees in the straw. Copper lowered his head and rested it on her shoulder, just as he had done in the auction pen. She understood now. He wasn't just any horse. He was the last living thing Jack had touched, the last reminder of the man who couldn't stand to see an animal suffer. And she knew, with a certainty that felt like a hand gripping her heart, that this wasn't coincidence. This was a message, and the message was only beginning to unfold. Because 3 days later, Copper would lead her to something buried at the base of the white oak, something Jack had hidden there 13 years earlier, something that would shatter the silence she had lived in since his death and force the entire county to reconsider what they believed about love, loss, and the things that refused to stay buried. The morning after Alina identified the brand, Copper began acting strangely. He kept returning to the fence line nearest the white oak, pawing at the frozen ground, then looking back at her with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. She had spent 60 years reading horses, and this wasn't illness or agitation. This was direction he wanted her to follow. He led her across the pasture with the same deliberate gait she'd seen on the day he arrived, stopping directly beneath the oak's lowest branch, where the bark had been worn smooth by decades of weather and the single wooden cross Jack's brother had carved all those years ago. Copper lowered his head and pawed at a spot where the grass grew thinner, his hoof striking something that rang metallic through the morning stillness. Alina fetched a shovel from the barn. Her heart was hammering against her ribs as she broke through the crust of frozen earth. 8 inches down, the blade struck a solid object. She dropped to her knees, pulling away soil with her bare hands, and uncovered a military-issue ammunition box, rusted along the edges but still sealed tight. The weight of it told her it wasn't empty. She pried the lid open, and the first thing she saw was an envelope, yellowed and brittle, with her name written across the front in Jack's unmistakable handwriting. She hadn't seen that script in 13 years. The sight of it nearly buckled her. Inside the envelope were 3 items. The first was a letter. Jack had written it 8 months before he died, on the day his cardiologist told him the heart damage from the shrapnel was finally catching up. He'd never shared that prognosis with her. He'd kept the fear to himself, not wanting to burden her with the countdown. The letter spilled everything: how he'd been cashing in small insurance policies, selling a few acres on the backside of the property that Alina didn't even know were his, and socking the money away where she'd find it only if she truly needed it. He wrote that he'd buried it under the oak, the place where he'd promised to love her forever, so that if she ever reached the point of desperation and came digging, she'd know he was still keeping that promise. He ended the letter with a line that made her press her fist against her mouth. "If you're reading this, Ellie, it means you finally let something break your heart badly enough to look down. I'm sorry it took so long, but I'm right here." The second item was a savings bond certificate, purchased in 1994, matured and untouched, worth $42,000. Enough to settle the property taxes that had been strangling her for years, with plenty left over to repair the barn, the fences, the roof. Enough to pull the farm back from the edge. The third item was a photograph she had never seen before. It was taken at the county fair, the same day she'd met Jack. In the picture, she's 19, laughing at something off camera, a cone of cotton candy in her hand, completely unaware she's being photographed. On the back, Jack had written, "The day everything started. I knew before you did, I always knew." Alina sat under the oak for a long time, the letter in her lap, Copper standing over her like a sentinel. The math of it was staggering. If she hadn't gone to the auction, if she hadn't seen Copper in that kill pen, if she hadn't traded her ring, she would never have followed the horse to this spot. She would never have dug. Jack had counted on her stubbornness, her refusal to sell the ring, her willingness to trade the only thing she had left when the right reason finally came. And somehow, across 13 years of silence, a horse he had saved 3 decades ago had been the delivery mechanism for the message. News of the discovery spread through Chilton County with the speed of dry lightning. Lyle told his wife, who told the postmistress, who posted about it on the town's Facebook group. Within 48 hours, a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch was knocking on Alina's door. The headline read, "Widow trades wedding ring for dying horse. Horse leads her to husband's hidden legacy." The national outlets picked it up from there. By the end of the week, Alina's farm had become a pilgrimage site for people driving in from 3 states, hopping to see the horse that had carried a dead man's promise across 3 decades. But not everyone was celebrating. Dwayne Pettigrew saw the story on the evening news and immediately called his lawyer. He claimed the ring Alina gave him was worth significantly more than he'd realized, appraised later at nearly $3,000, and that the transaction, conducted without a formal valuation, was legally void. He wanted the horse back, or compensation equal to what he could have gotten from the kill buyer had he sold Copper by the pound, plus damages for the media attention that was, in his words, defaming his business practices. Alina received a certified letter threatening legal action if she didn't surrender Copper within 10 days. She read it standing in the barn, Copper's muzzle resting on her shoulder, and felt the old fear creep back in, the fear of losing everything. Dr. Miriam Okonkwo was the first to respond when Alina told her about the threat. The vet called the Ohio Veterinary Medical Association and then a lawyer she knew through rescue work, a woman named Annika Patel who specialized in equine law. Annika reviewed the case and discovered something that turned Dwayne's threat inside out. The brand on Copper's shoulder, the Vance mark, was registered with the American Horse Council as a mark of lifetime sanctuary placement. Jack had filed the paperwork back in the late 90s for every rescue he trained and rehomed, stipulating that if the horse ever ended up in a kill pen or slaughter auction, the original rescue organization retained legal ownership. That organization was the Vance Equine Rescue, an entity that still existed on paper in the state of Ohio. Alina was its sole beneficiary. Legally, Copper had never stopped being hers. Dwayne had sold her a horse she already owned. But the revelations didn't stop there. During the legal back and forth, Annika began tracing Copper's chain of custody from the Michigan family who had originally adopted him to the kill pen in Chilton County. What she found made her stop and reread the records 3 times. Copper had been sold 7 times over the past 8 years, each time to an owner who kept him for less than 12 months before passing him along. Last owner, a man in Indiana who surrendered him to the auction, had purchased him from a trader in Kentucky. That trader had acquired him from a rescue in West Virginia, and that rescue had gotten him from a woman named Kathleen Sullivan, the original adopter from Michigan, who had called the auction house herself to sell him, not because he was old or sick, but because he kept escaping. He kept jumping fences and running, and every time they tracked him down, he was heading southeast. Toward Ohio, toward the land where he was born. Tommy Rourke, the old farrier, filled in the final piece when he drove down from Indiana to see Copper for himself. He stood at the fence, watching the old chestnut graze beside Elena, and his eyes went wet. "I remember that horse," he said. "Jack had a theory about him. Said Copper had a compass in his head that he could find his way back from anywhere. He tested it once, drove him 50 miles out and let him go in a pasture he'd never seen. 2 days later, Copper was standing at the barn door. Jack always said that horse was his backup plan. If anything ever happened to him, Copper would find you." Elena stared at Tommy. She had never heard this story, neither had anyone else. Jack had kept it between himself and his farrier, a secret theory about one horse's impossible navigation. And now, 13 years after Jack's heart gave out, the horse had done exactly what Jack believed he would do. He had escaped a kill pen, not by breaking fences, but by surviving long enough to be seen by the one person who would recognize something of Jack in his eyes. The 10-day deadline came and went. Dwayne Pettigrew's lawsuit collapsed when Annika produced the sanctuary paperwork and a counterfiling for fraud, alleging that Dwayne had knowingly accepted a wedding ring as payment without disclosing the horse's branded status, information he was legally required to check. Dwayne dropped the case and returned the ring to Elena, along with a written apology to avoid further legal action. She took the ring back, but did not put it on. Not yet. She placed it in the ammunition box beside Jack's letter under the oak tree and covered it back up. The ring had done its job. It had bought the horse who brought the message. And Elena understood now that Jack's love had never been in the metal. It had been in the things he set in motion, the animals he saved, the sanctuary he dreamed of, the wife he believed would find her way back to purpose even after he was gone. Word of the miracle spread beyond Ohio. Donations began arriving at the farm, small at first, then larger. A woman in California sent $500 with a note that said, "I lost my husband last year. This story gave me hope." A trucking company in Pennsylvania offered to haul hay for free. A contractor from Cleveland drove down and replaced Elena's barn roof without charging a penny. By spring, the farm was transformed, and Elena made a decision. She filed the paperwork to reactivate the Vance Equine Rescue, this time as a full sanctuary for old horses who had been discarded. The first official resident, beyond Copper, was a blind Appaloosa mare named Pearl, who had been scheduled for euthanasia. The second was a gelding who had been seized from a hoarding situation in Licking County. But the true payoff, the moment that would break everyone's heart wide open, didn't come until the first anniversary of Copper's arrival. That was the day Elena finally put the ring back on her finger, standing beside the white oak. And that was the day Copper did the thing that no one expected, the thing that would make hardened reporters weep into their notebooks, because he didn't just nuzzle her hand. This time, he did something he'd never done with anyone but Jack. On the morning of the first anniversary, Elena walked to the white oak just as the sun cracked the horizon. She had retrieved the ammunition box the night before, unearthed it by lantern light, and now she held the ring in her palm, still cool from the earth. Lyle and his wife stood at a respectful distance. Dr. Okonkwo had come too, parking her truck by the barn and leaning against the fender with her arms crossed against the chill. Even Tommy Rourke had made the drive from Indiana, his old farrier's hands tucked into the pockets of a coat that smelled like tobacco and saddle soap. A handful of neighbors lined the fence. Word had spread that Elena was going to put the ring back on, and no one wanted to miss whatever happened next. Copper stood beside her, his chestnut coat now gleaming with the luster of a year's proper care. He had filled out, the ribs no longer visible, the rain rot healed, the dull eyes replaced with the bright alertness of an animal who knew he was safe. When Elena lifted the ring and slid it onto her finger, The same finger it had occupied for 51 years, she felt nothing dramatic, just the familiar weight, just the return of something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. She looked at the grave, at the wooden cross, at the horse who had led her here. Then Copper stepped forward. He lowered his massive head, not to her hand this time, but lower still. His front legs bent. His joints, stiff with age, protested audibly, but he kept going, folding himself down into the straw-colored grass until both knees touched the frozen earth. He stayed there, kneeling before Alina, his head bowed like a knight before a queen. No one had asked him to do this. No one had trained him in 13 years. But Jack had taught him to kneel, a trick he'd used to delight children at the county fair, and Copper had never performed it for another human being since the day Jack died. Now on the anniversary of his arrival, before the woman who had traded everything to save him, he knelt. Lyle turned away, his shoulders shaking. Tommy Rourke removed his cap and pressed it to his chest. Dr. Okonkwo covered her mouth with both hands, and Alina, her eyes streaming, knelt too, right there in the frozen grass, and wrapped her arms around the old horse's neck. They stayed like that for a long time, two agging creatures on their knees at the foot of a grave, while the small crowd of witnesses stood in absolute silence, each of them suddenly aware that they were seeing something that could not be adequately explained or ever forgotten. The moment changed something in Chilton County. People who had heard the story secondhand and dismissed it as sentimental exaggeration now saw the cell phone video that Lyle's wife had captured, the image of the kneeling horse, and found themselves weeping at their kitchen tables. The video circulated widely, accumulating millions of views within weeks. News crews returned. Alina gave exactly one interview, sitting on her porch with Copper visible in the paddock behind her, and said simply, "Love doesn't die, it just changes shape. Sometimes it comes back with 4 legs and a white star." The Vance Equine Rescue officially reopened 3 months later with a ceremony attended by the county commissioner, who presented Alina with a proclamation recognizing her lifelong commitment to animal welfare. The savings bond money had restored the barn, reinforced the fences, and funded the first year of operating expenses. Donations from the viral video covered the rest. By the second summer, the sanctuary housed 11 rescued horses, each with their own story of near-death and redemption. Kathleen Sullivan, the woman who had originally adopted Copper and later sold him, drove down from Michigan after seeing the story. She stood at the fence line, unable to meet Alina's eyes. "I didn't know," she said. "He kept running. I thought he was just difficult. I didn't understand what he was trying to do." Alina put a hand on her shoulder. "Neither did I," she said, "but he knew, the whole time he knew." It was during Kathleen's visit that the final revelation emerged, the one that would end up in the epilogue of every retelling of this story. Kathleen mentioned that when she had first received Copper from the Vance family, Jack had given her a small envelope with a photograph and a note saying, "For Copper's next owner, if he ever wanders back." She had forgotten about the envelope entirely, packed away in a box of horse records that had followed her through 3 moves. She retrieved it from her car, a faded manila envelope sealed with brittle tape. Inside was a photo of Copper as a colt, standing beside a young Jack, and a letter addressed to whoever finds this horse. The letter, written in the same handwriting as the one buried under the oak, explained that Jack had always suspected Copper possessed an uncanny homing instinct. He wrote that if the horse ever showed up on the Vance property again, it would be because Jack was no longer there, and that whoever found him should know this. "Copper isn't just a horse. He's my promise to Ellie that I'll find a way back to her, even if I have to borrow 4 legs to do it." The letter was dated 3 months before Jack died. Alina read it standing beside the oak tree, Copper grazing peacefully a few feet away. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Then she looked at the ring on her finger, the ring that had been payment for a dying horse, the ring that had unlocked a buried fortune, the ring she had worn through grief and poverty, and the slow erosion of hope. She twisted it absently, something she'd done 1,000 times before, but this time her thumb caught on something she had never noticed, an inscription on the inside of the band. She pulled off the ring and squinted at the tiny letters, worn thin by decades of wear, barely legible. It said, "Come back to me." Jack had engraved it before their wedding, a private message pressed against her skin for 52 years, and she had never once thought to look. He had always planned to find her again. The horse was only the delivery. The message had been there all along. Alina still lives on that farm. Copper still grazes at the edge of the north pasture, and every evening just before sundown, He walks to the white oak and stands there as if waiting. She joins him when she can, and sometimes she talks to Jack, and sometimes she just listens to the wind move through the branches. The sanctuary now holds 23 rescued horses. The barn roof doesn't leak. The fences are straight. The ring is back on her finger, and she still twists it when she's thinking, the worn inscription pressing into her skin. But here is the thing Alina would want you to know. It was never really about the horse. It was about paying attention. For over 5 decades, she wore a message on her hand and never saw it. Come back to me. Jack had written it there before their life together even began, and it sat against her pulse through every anniversary, every hardship, every lonely night after he was gone. She didn't need to find a buried letter or a kneeling horse to know he loved her. She needed to learn how to see the love that was already there, still operating, still finding its way to her in forms she never expected. So the question the story leaves behind is this: what are you carrying right now that you haven't yet noticed? What messages are still trying to reach you, delivered by old horses, or wedding rings, or calls you've been ignoring, or memories that surface when you least expect them? Jack Vance believed love doesn't end at the grave. He believed it borrows whatever shape it needs to finish the journey. If that's true, then the world is full of hidden compasses, and we are all being guided home more often than we realize. We just have to be willing to follow the horse. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need the reminder, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Until then, keep your eyes open. You never know what's kneeling in the grass, waiting for you to notice.